At the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, U-2 pilot Charles W. Maultsby was flying near the North Pole when he was blinded by the northern lights. He had been on the mission as part of Project Stardust to collect air samples and monitor Soviet nuclear test activity at Novaya Zemlya, an island off of Siberia. The lights, however, obscured his view of the night sky and prevented navigation by the stars. Maultsby's radio connection continued to fade until he reportedly picked up the sounds of Russian music from a local radio station. He had mistakenly flown into Soviet territory. Quickly turning back home, the U-2 found itself being pursued by Soviet MiG fighters, and the only reinforcements available on the American side were rushing to the scene armed with nuclear-tipped missiles. The US and the USSR had been conducting nuclear weapons tests around the globe in secluded, uninhabited locations. U-2 pilots had been closely monitoring radiation stemming from Novaya Zemlya, an Arctic Ocean archipelago in northern Russia, where the Soviets were conducting nuclear tests. On October 27th, Air Force Captain Charles Maultsby was tasked with flying to the North Pole in his U-2 plane to collect samples of air on filter paper that could determine radioactivity. He was an experienced pilot who had gone on that same mission for Project Stardust several times. There were almost no expectations that the mission could result in valuable findings or in any sort of tense situation. Of the 42 U-2 pilots sent to the North Pole that October, only 6 had returned with evidence of radioactivity. The targeted location was far away enough from the Soviet Union as to not arouse suspicion, but close enough for clouds and fallout to reveal whether a nuclear test had been conducted. At Alaskan midnight on the morning of the 27th, Maultsby took off. An hour into the flight, he passed the last radio beacon on his route at Barter Island. GPS wasn't operational until 1993, 2 years after the USSR collapsed. Maultsby had to rely on ground navigation systems, or instead of those, on the position of the stars. By the time he should have been about halfway to the North Pole, he attempted to read the stars using a green card. It would have indicated the alignment of the stars at the time of night if facing the correct way. He should have been able to position himself based on Arcturus, the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. Vega should be placed to his northwest, while Polaris should have been above him, signaling his proximity to the North Pole. Maultsby was unable to determine any of these assumptions. As the northern lights danced over the sky, the light impeded his reading of the stars. According to his journal entry, in light of the blinding lights, he decided to, quote, turn left for 90 degrees and then immediately reverse the turn for 270 degrees until you're heading back along your same track, only in the opposite direction. Misdirected by the Aurora Borealis, the expert pilot was headed in the worst direction possible. By the time he should have been arriving at Eielson Air Force Base, he was instead entering Soviet airspace. Detecting the intrusion, 2 airfields near Chukotka sent out interceptor MiGs. At least 6 of them flew towards the lone American U-2 spy plane, intending to take it down. Having a U-2 plane flying over the Soviet Union was riskier than having one approach Cuba. The Soviet government would have every reason to see the entry of an American plane into their territory as a provocative act, or even worse, an act of war. The lost pilot, unknowingly, was risking setting off the spark that could end the world. Kennedy stopped by the Oval Office as his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who had recently learned that Maultsby was missing, reported to the Chief of Intelligence at the State Department, Roger Hilsman. Of the ongoing crisis, he informed him that the pilot could have accidentally entered Soviet territory. Hilsman had also learned from National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy that MiG-19 fighter jets were pursuing the U-2 plane, and that the U.S. Strategic Air Command was preparing American fighters for a rescue mission. At 2 p.m., the Pentagon updated the White House, quote, apparently gyro trouble began, and he got off course. picked up by HFDF, High Frequency Direction Finder, off Wrangel Island, seems to have overflown or come close to Soviet territory. Not clear at this time exactly what cause was. Russian fighters scrambled. Ours too. Now gliding into Kotzebue, Alaska. That day would later be known as Black Saturday in the White House. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was demanding that the United States withdraw its missiles from Turkey, and Kennedy had just informed the public of the missiles in Cuba a few days before. That very same day, another U-2 plane, piloted by Rudolf Anderson, was shot down over Banes, Cuba, by a Cuban S-75 Divina surface-to-air missile provided by the Soviet Union. Cuba had been blocked off from all imports by the United States since February, with only food and humanitarian supplies entering the island. Soviet nuclear-armed submarines and U.S. warships were challenging each other at sea, ready to strike if the order came. October 27th would later be described by historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. as the, quote, most dangerous moment in human history. And to top it all off, Maultsby was lost within the Soviet Union with Soviet fighters chasing him. At the same time, the Soviet Union believed they were under attack. The United States Strategic Air Command was on DEFCON 2 level, ready for nuclear war, with over 3,000 warheads targeted at the USSR. Castro was begging Khrushchev to destroy the United States with nuclear weapons at the embassy in Havana. The United States was unaware of it at the time, but 2 Cuban nuclear missile sites were armed and ready to target American cities. Additionally, the Soviets had moved guided missiles within Cuba to firing position, just 15 miles from Guantanamo Bay. Two F-102 Delta Dagger fighter aircraft were deployed by the U.S. Air Force to locate and bring Maultsby back to American territory. The Soviet Air Defense Command had launched its own fighters, 6 MiG-19 planes, to intercept the American U-2. Due to the high-stakes situation bordering on wartime, the Delta Dagger fighters had switched out their Falcon air-to-air missiles for nuclear missiles, just in case a major confrontation ensued. The Pentagon had officially switched to DEFCON 3 alert status. The Delta Dagger pilots could launch nuclear weapons at their discretion should an emergency call for it. Maultsby was being tracked by Strategic Air Command, as were the Soviet aircraft thanks to SAC's interception of Soviet air defense traffic. But they could not share these developments outright with the pilot of the U-2 plane, as their intelligence capabilities were top secret. The navigator at Eielson noticed that the sun was beginning to rise over Alaska, meaning that if Maultsby couldn't see it, then he was too deep into Soviet airspace. But if he could, it would take him home. The navigator contacted the U-2 pilot, who informed that he could not see the faint glow of the rising sun. He was ordered to shift 15 degrees to the left. Navigators were able to guide him until Orion's belt became visible to his right, and he could head in the correct direction towards Alaska. Slowly but surely, their efforts started paying off. Maultsby was struggling to listen to the Alaskan transmissions, which were getting fainter and fainter, invaded by static noise. Still, he was able to pick up a civilian radio station playing American pop music. He was finally heading in the right direction. Yet he was running out of fuel. He shut off the engine to keep the plane running, which shut down the flow of electricity. The cockpit turned black, and the cabin was depressurized, which inflated his suit. All Maultsby could do was glide back to Alaska, a task for which the U-2 was particularly well equipped due to its 80 feet wingspan and small 63-foot body. 10 minutes passed by, and the plane began losing altitude. By the time he entered United States territory, he had dropped 45,000 feet, but the glowing sun rays gave the pilot hope. Minutes later, the 2 Delta Dagger aircraft met up with him. With the plane's remaining battery power, he contacted them, and they welcomed him home. Maultsby had to conduct an emergency landing at Kotzebue Sound, a military radar station, with the blessing of no crosswinds blowing and the help of the U-2's parachute. The U-2 landed on the snow at 2:25 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time after 10 hours and 25 minutes of flight, breaking the record for the longest U-2 flight. Maultsby had to be helped out of the plane as his legs were too cold to move. About 12 Eskimos and personnel from the station gathered to assist him. The American fighters flew away, having completed their mission. The details of the mission and the mistake that almost started World War III were kept a secret from the public for many years after. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered the following U-2 spy plane headed for the North Pole to immediately return. He canceled all U-2 air sampling missions and requested an Air Force investigation into the causes of the incident that remained sealed. The general state of emergency remained until the following day, but the immediate crisis had been averted. On October 28th, Khrushchev sent a message to President Kennedy agreeing to dismantle the Cuban nuclear missile sites, stating, quote, "In order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace, to give an assurance to all people who crave peace, and to reassure the American people who, I am certain, also want peace, as do the people of the Soviet Union, the Soviet government, in addition to earlier instructions on the discontinuation of further work on weapons construction sites, has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you described as offensive, and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union." Khrushchev also spoke to the aggravation caused by multiple American entries into Soviet territory, mentioning Maultsby's flight by stating, quote, "A still more dangerous case occurred on October 28th, when one of your reconnaissance planes intruded over Soviet borders in the Chukotka Peninsula area in the north and flew over our territory. The question is, Mr. President, how should we regard this? What is this? A provocation? One of your planes violates our frontier during this anxious time we are both experiencing, when everything has been put into combat readiness. Is it not a fact that an intruding American plane could be easily taken for a nuclear bomber, which might push us to a fateful step? And all the more so since the US government and Pentagon long ago declared that you are maintaining a continuous nuclear bomber patrol." In response, the Kennedy administration temporarily grounded all U-2 missions.